I agree. Whoever said that. So on this night, we say something like, Gemar Chatima Tova. You can say that to one another. May we end with a good inscription, a good sealing in the book, a good signature, rather, in the book of life. May this day indeed conclude well for us. The story in the New York Times brought worry to many people. A French diplomat expressed the belief that, quote, self-government has proven itself a failure. A member of England's House of Lords told a reporter that democracy has been on trial and it has failed. Separation is inevitable. In 1861, when that story was filed at the dawn of the American Civil War, many foreign monarchs somewhat gleefully watched on as the United States headed toward rupture. Our nation was deeply divided on the questions of slavery, states' rights, westward expansion, and sadly, compromise eluded both the leaders of the North and the South. I imagine wagers were made on when and where the president and the Congress would abdicate. I have to tell you, friends, I have worried and wondered in the last few years whether the current divisions in our nation are as serious and toxic as those divisions in pre-Civil War days. Could they indeed lead us to a dissolution of our democracy? Now, our issues are different, but still they represent fundamental disagreements that, at least in my heart and mind, elicit a great amount of angst. Consider these: the denial of science. Constant arguing about the climate will do nothing to solve the problems. The astonishing devastation from Hurricane Ian surely underscores the reality that humanity has a planetary climate disaster in progress. The denial of the totality of the human being. We've made progress in understanding that the range of sexual orientation and gender is a natural part of human psyche and physiology. Yet to some, these seem antithetical to their biblical or social order, and they regard them as intolerable. The reality of black and brown oppression. It seems like we're contending over terminology like critical race theory, rather than striving to find a solution to the systemic racism that plagues us. And the growth of hate. You may have seen this. A few weeks ago, the ADL published a document containing a list of members of the Oath Keepers, a violent hatred and racist group. And among the more than 38,000 names were people serving in active military units, law enforcement officers, government employees, teachers, religious leaders, business people, and even elected officials, as we saw even with our Madison City Council. The ADL hastened to stress that not all of these people may have been active members of this hate group, but the range of public service professionals on these lists demonstrates the extent to which extremist ideology has caught on in America. And we can't solve any issue that confronts us if we continue to hate one another, or at least yell at one another across philosophical chasms. So on this note, and on this night of atonement, let us consider the ways in which we at least can recreate ourselves and declare that being made in God's image means elevating the status of every person, whether they are close or whether they are far. Now, if we feel this is an enormous challenge, I make one simple request, and that is that we maintain optimism that things can change for the better. Optimism can fortify the soul against the relentless problems that confront us in our world. Optimism can help maintain our internal strength to improve that world. And optimism can support the love that brings people closer together. Now, repairing the world takes more than adopting good feelings, of course. And while Yom Kippur is surely a day about the intention of the heart, it is also an important moment for us to consider the ways in which we fulfill any positive intentions that we develop as a result of today's spiritual work. Success in our human duty to one another is ultimately determined by what we do, of course, and how we act toward others. I think then, on this night, about a previous leader of our nation who might have exemplified some of this rabbinic thinking, though he was a person who specifically expressed no particular religious connection. Earlier this year, you may have read it, some of you. Political analyst John Avlon published a book earlier about President Lincoln and his optimism and actions in addressing the struggles of the Civil War. Lincoln's approach to solving the conflict can suggest ways to bring forth union from our current era's disunity and hopefully give us inspiration, give us that same inspiration we need to continue this struggle. As of 1861, a civil war had never been fought on the scale that was about to happen to our nation, and that is why there were apparently many foreign leaders just waiting to pounce on the presumed failure of American democracy. Those expectations were prescient and well-founded. During the American Civil War, our nation recorded the greatest number of casualties of any similar domestic conflict. The war needed to end, and Lincoln was determined to wage peace. This was his thinking. He determined early on that, presuming the North would win, that he would not bring the South, not its economy, not its leaders, not its military, nor its citizens, to anything like submission. And though history shows that winners divide and conquer, Lincoln sincerely believed that there was the possibility of what he termed a magnanimous peace, one of political reunion, financial and geographic expansion to benefit the nation as a whole, and cultural reintegration of the South. The assassination of Lincoln extinguished many aspects of his program. Some were acted upon, but none of the next leaders of our nation exhibited the same charisma or optimism as Lincoln. For in the end, it was Lincoln's personal approach to peacemaking that was the primary ingredient to the resolution of conflict. In his second inaugural address, near the conclusion of the war, when things were very clear in which way it was going, he tried to elevate the humanity and diminish the differences of each side. In his mind, he needed to bring forth the common humanity of all. Addressing the emotions of Southerners, he said that they were victims of their inherited culture, and they weren't intrinsically bad people. And he implied that Northerners would have done the same thing had they been in the same situation. Lincoln employed these tools of personal style to win over the insurgents. He possessed what John Avlon termed a certain kind of Midwest moral humility, which included modesty that was self-effacing and humor that was disarming. More importantly, Lincoln avoided expressing a moral superiority over his opponents. He stated that the Civil War was God's punishment for the sin of slavery, which was something from which both sides benefited in the past and for which both sides were responsible. In that respect, both the North and the South needed to make concessions and compromises to bring them back together. When I read Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is relatively short, I see references to forgiveness and love, empathy for the North and the South, calls for righteous behavior, and a determination toward an ultimate solution. And in the end, he advocated the human quality of courage. Both sides needed to dare to come to the negotiating table. Both sides needed to risk the necessary cultural reintegration of one with the other, and both sides needed to believe sincerely that benevolence could repair the hurt of the nation and elevate everyone. It was optimism that drove Lincoln and his closest advisors toward the successful conclusion of the conflict. It was empathy and grace that compelled Lincoln to go to Army hospitals, talking with both the wounded Union soldiers and the captured Southern fighters. As leader of the nation, Lincoln acted for the benefit of the nation. He didn't consider his individual accomplishment. Self-aggrandizement was not his desire or style. He hoped to bind the wounds of the country and prepare it for recovery. Again, his assassination put a halt to much of his program. But as I look back on what he did and what his attitudes were, I think that perhaps his actions were the embodiment of what our rabbis wrote in Pirkei Avot. Not that he read it, but it was interesting of the synergy that's there, that it's not incumbent upon us to complete the task, but we are not free to evade the responsibility toward that task. During his careers as lawyer, as representative in Congress, and as president, Lincoln confronted many disputes. And he actually might have known something about how the rabbis of Jewish tradition suggest resolving something called in Hebrew a machloket, Hebrew in the English being a dispute. In detailing the disputes that occurred between the academies, say, of Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai, the rabbis differentiate between disputes that are constructive, whose resolution will give lasting value, and those disputes that are destructive, whose resolutions would not have lasting value. They label the constructive machlakot, disputes, as being conducted for the sake of heaven, and the destructive machlakot, that's disputes, as being conducted not for the sake of heaven. Now, taking these descriptions to heart, the rabbis concluded, therefore, that there are four essential components that defined and shaped constructive arguments. That's the one we're going to be focusing on, or disputes where the resolution would be significant for the sake of heaven. First, despite disagreeing on the fine points of religious law, they insist that disputants maintain close personal relationships based on mutual respect. Machlakot, disputes, needed to be focused on issues, not personalities. Further, disputants needed to agree that the purpose of the debate was for a noble cause. Proving merely the rightness of one side was not a reason for engaging in a dispute. The sides needed to ensure their motivations were pure and noble. Third, each disputant needed to listen well and accept the possibility and accept the evidence that each one may be wrong. And on the other hand, each disputant needed to accept the fact that both sides might be right. And then they had to agree to live together, that is, even though they didn't necessarily agree. And there was one further common understanding that each of them had. We find this in text. The academies of Hillel and Shammai each asserted, or had to assert, the belief that the ultimate conclusion had the permission, the assent of the living God, who is the source and motivation of everything. Now, with this common frame of reference, they believed that they could argue over truly significant matters and yet develop and maintain relationships in communal life. They believed that the manner in which they achieved resolution was in many instances more important than the resolution itself. As in so many parts of life, as we know, how we process an issue or a dispute could be more important than the ultimate resolution. Further, by focusing on the process as much as, or even more so, the resolution, more than the resolution, we may be able to have optimism that disputes can be resolved and relationships repaired. And we surely have plenty of places where we can apply these teachings. As a nation, we need to address the great divisions among people and parties and government. Here are a few, but I don't have to teach this group anything. Extremist rhetoric threatens the social order. The violence among our people has increased. The concept of truth has been on the critical list for a while. Human decency and kindness is ridiculed. Voting rights and the processes of democracy are being affected. The bright promise of a World Wide Web humming along to bring people and information closer together is in peril. On these and other matters, it would be understandable to deny optimism to ourselves. But my friends, each of us must play a role in the rebuilding of the bonds of trust. Each of us must search for an opportunity wherever we find ourselves, in schools, our places of work, our social clubs, whether we're here at home or we're traveling, to move one person at least with whom we might disagree on any of these matters, to move them toward a desire to heal. Each of us can apply that fourfold approach, maybe the fivefold approach of Hillel and Shammai, so that we bring ourselves to the place of Isaiah when he suggested, "L'chu na v'nivachacha," come, let us reach a mutual understanding. That's one way to bring healing to our society. Now, we may be right, and we may be wrong. We do need to arrive at a place where we can respect each other and think about really what's best for our nation. It was during Lincoln's first inaugural address, on the threshold of civil war, that he challenged the nation to maintain unity. At that time, this is what he said: "Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be," you know this line, "by the better angels of our nature." Finding those better angels, that is the challenge today. Lincoln's sincere optimism remained with him even over the course of 4 years of war. And I wonder whether that optimism can be ours, especially at a time of such great peril and division. Can we foresee a time of building from the debris of destruction, building a stronger and more unified society? It first takes optimism. Can we look toward a time when we can engage in disputes, the results of which will have only positive, lasting value? That takes optimism. Can we engage in the struggle for the soul of our nation? Can each of us engage in that struggle? That takes optimism. Can we remain engaged in finding solutions, hoping that our conclusion will indeed be one of rebuilding with confidence and hope? That too takes optimism. Yom Kippur is a day to celebrate the awareness of our soul, to take an honest accounting of how we feel and how we act. In Hebrew, we say we are looking for a cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting, literally, an accounting of the soul. So indeed, may our cheshbon hanefesh, the accounting of our soul on this day, be for the good and the noble, the holy and significant. May we find willing partners with whom we can have sincere and robust disagreement and then resolve to work together, each of us and all of us, for the betterment of our world. Gamar Chatima Tova. May this be a time of sweetness and progress for us all.
of struggle can we see a ray of hope, one pale ray, reaching for the day. We can build a beautiful city, yes we can, yes we can. We can build a beautiful city, not a city of angels, but we can build a city of men. We may not reach the ending, but we can start slowly but truly mending, brick by brick, heart by heart.